It didn't begin with a speech, a global summit, or a solemn warning from the White House. It began in the stillness of a Washington night. The moment the clock struck 10:47. On the cold blue glow of Truth Social, a line of text appeared like a blade slicing through the world's order. South Africa would not be invited to the 2026 G20. U.S. aid would be suspended indefinitely. No consultation, no warning, no diplomatic overture to soften the blow. Only the raw, unmasked force of power, launched straight at a continent far too familiar with commands issued from elsewhere. But what stunned the world wasn't just the content of that message. It was the way it was unleashed. In the middle of the night. On social media, no fanfare, yet louder than any speech ever delivered at the United Nations. Within seconds, ambassadors' phones lit up. G20's Coordination Center reopened its emergency lines. In Johannesburg, a few South African advisors hadn't even finished their tea when the entire government ignited over a single sentence. Why could one keystroke trigger a geopolitical earthquake? Because beneath its icy surface lay another accusation, one loaded with insult and dread. South Africa, it said, was following the path of Traoré, a comparison powerful enough to shake closed-door meeting rooms from Washington to Paris. Because it didn't point at just one country, it pointed at a model. A philosophy, a flame spreading across Africa ever since a young man in Ouagadougou declared that a nation's resources belong to its people. That night at 10:47 wasn't just a statement. It was the opening shot in the greatest battle for self-determination of the 21st century. And from that moment on, no one stayed calm, because the world understood this. When a president replaces diplomacy with social media, what follows is always a storm. And this storm carries the names of sovereignty, memory, and the awakening of an entire continent. The journey has begun, and you are standing right at its first spark. By the next morning, Washington hadn't even shaken off the silence of the long night when another reality split open like lightning across the sky. Strategic analysis centers lit up all at once. The tickers running across CNN and BBC were no longer speculation, they were confirmation. A core member of the G20 had been kicked out of the world's biggest economic table by a midnight post. And at the same moment, aid once considered irreplaceable was sliced away like a cold, merciless cut. Phones inside the U.S. State Department rang non-stop, not because they wanted to explain, but because the world demanded answers. Paris called for an emergency meeting. Berlin condemned the move as a breach of international norms. Tokyo was stunned, unsure whether the post-Cold War order was still intact. And in Brussels, policy experts exchanged complicated glances. Knowing this wasn't some impulsive decision, it was a message aimed straight at the heart of Africa. In Nairobi, editors kept asking reporters for more data. In Lagos, the morning news tore up its entire program to cover this unprecedented event. Addis Ababa, capital of the African Union, extended its internal meetings for hours. No one believed this was just an angry reaction, because behind those seemingly impulsive lines was the tremor of something far bigger. Financial markets reacted instantly. The rand wobbled, South African bonds shook, but the real fear wasn't in the charts. It was in the question experts from New York to Singapore suddenly found themselves asking, could a single post truly rattle the architecture of global power? Or had that architecture been hollow for years, just waiting for one hard touch to crack it open? That touch had arrived, and the fragments falling weren't landing only on South Africa. They were crashing onto the global order itself, onto the very idea of who gets to exclude whom from the negotiating table. From that moment on, the world understood, the geopolitical battlefield had expanded. And South Africa, whether it wanted to or not, had become the epicenter of a historic tremor. To understand why a land reform bill could shake the entire world, you have to return to where the wound first opened. In 1913, South Africa passed the Native Land Act, dry on the surface, but devastating in its impact. 90% of the fertile land was locked into the hands of a white minority. while the vast majority of indigenous people were pushed onto barren strips of earth, thin as torn edges on a map. It wasn't just land that was taken. Memory was erased, villages were uprooted, bloodlines were severed, and from that moment, South Africa's history was written in absences. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison in 1990, he carried more than a dream of reconciliation. He carried a promise that someday, the land would return to those who had lost it. But that promise became trapped for decades inside circles of negotiation, valuations, and diplomatic compromises where pain was never weighed equally with profit. Every document turned injustice into metrics, and every metric turned memory into something that had to be bargained for. There are families who have lived on their ancestral soil since their great-grandparents' time. Yet legally they have no right to stand on that very ground. There are tracts of land abandoned for decades, yet they cannot be handed back to communities living in hunger just beyond the fence. No one listened to the silent cries coming from the rural heartlands, places where land had long been treated as a trophy of a brutal era. So when the South African government passed the 2024 Expropriation Act, it wasn't a rash decision. It was history finally finding its way forward. For the first time in more than a century, the state declared that land is not merely property. Land is memory. Land is evidence of lives ripped from their roots. And that memory cannot wait another generation. When poor farmers finally held in their hands a certificate granting them rights to the soil beneath their feet, they weren't just receiving a plot. That was the moment history, after more than 100 years, turned back to acknowledge them. And that single moment sent a shiver through the West, because they understood a truth they rarely say aloud. When a people reclaim their memory, they reclaim a power no one can ever take away. When the world says South Africa is following Traoré's path, it isn't a careless comparison. It's the echo of a model reshaping Africa's balance of power, a model not born in the conference rooms of global financial institutions, but in the red dust of the Sahel, where a young soldier dared to ask the question generations before him were too afraid to ask: how can a country rich in resources be poor to the bone? In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did what most post-colonial nations never dared. He cut the invisible strings tying the economy to external forces. When Traoré nationalized gold mines, then lithium and other minerals, the world expected the small nation to collapse under Western pressure. But something else happened. For the first time, profits from mineral wealth flowed into villages, hospitals, and schools. People in the Sahel no longer watched foreign corporate convoys as symbols of loss. They saw projects built by their own hands, funded by the resources beneath their soil. Traoré didn't just change the economy. He changed the meaning of sovereignty. Sovereignty stopped being a constitutional slogan and became a set of actions, expelling foreign forces that disrespected national authority, ending exploitative extraction contracts, creating systems where profits went directly to communities. Most importantly, he made people understand that dependency is not destiny. So when South Africa passed the 2024 Expropriation Act, the West immediately saw Burkina Faso's silhouette behind it. Because even if one nation speaks of minerals and the other of farmland, their shared message is unmistakable. Natural resources, whether dug from the earth or grown upon it, are not bargaining chips. They are rights, they are memory, and they belong to the people who have paid the highest price for losing them. Analysts now call this the expansion of the Traoré doctrine. If Burkina Faso questioned who should control gold and lithium, South Africa answered with land. If Burkina Faso reclaimed sovereignty through nationalization, South Africa reclaimed it through historical restitution. At their core, both moves strike at an old order in which Africa's wealth was extracted by outsiders while Africans stood at the margins of their own future. And this is what unsettles the West. One nation reclaiming its resources can be labeled a challenge. But when two do it, then three, then four, it is no longer an anomaly. It becomes a model, a precedent, a wave named after one man, but powered by the voices of hundreds of millions who had long been denied control over their destiny. When South African farmers pressed their shovels into soil they could legally call their own for the first time. They weren't thinking about Traoré. But the world was. Because from gold to land, a new order is taking shape. And every shovel breaking the ground is a declaration. Africa is not just rising. Africa is rewriting the rules of power in this century. Behind the firm declarations delivered in front of cameras, Washington lives another life, a world of windowless meeting rooms, tables buried under briefing folders, and debates that must never reach the public. Just hours after the 1047 shockwave, while South Africa became the epicenter of a diplomatic storm, the real battle wasn't fought on television, it erupted quietly in the corridors of America's capital. On the third floor of the State Department, the emergency rooms stayed lit through the night. National security advisors, Africa specialists, economic strategists, everyone was summoned. A heavy question hung in the room. Was this merely diplomatic misconduct? Or the beginning of a new world order the US could no longer control? On the large board at the center, two phrases were circled in red: Expropriation Act and Traoré Doctrine. Every senior official understood that South Africa's land reform wasn't just domestic policy, it was a signal that African sovereignty had risen to a level strong enough to make Washington uneasy. On the left side of the room sat the sanctions camp. To them, South Africa was a challenger that needed to be crushed instantly. A retired general, speaking through clenched teeth, jabbed a finger at the map of southern Africa. They've taken our aid for decades. They've benefited from AGOA. And now they act like our influence doesn't matter. If there are no consequences, others will follow. Across the table were the economic strategists, more cautious. They pointed to charts showing South Africa's expanding trade with China and its deepening integration with the BRICS network. One analyst spoke slowly. If we push them too far, they'll turn completely to BRICS. And if South Africa slips out of the Western sphere, the entire continent will follow. Silence filled the room, not because everyone agreed, but because no one could deny the truth of it. A few hours later, in a separate White House meeting, the tone hardened. National security officials presented a list of pre-drafted measures: suspension of all non-emergency aid, visa restrictions on South African officials and their families, and an evaluation of whether to expel South Africa from AGOA, the trade pillar binding the US to Africa. When the number emerged, over 100,000 South African jobs directly reliant on AGOA, the room shifted. This wasn't diplomacy, it was leverage. But then came a different voice. A young advisor, known for blunt honesty, stood and said, "If we punish a country for correcting historical injustice, we become the enemy of justice. The real danger isn't South Africa losing aid. It's America losing the moral image we've spent decades building." The comment didn't change policy, but it planted hesitation. Because ever since Traoré's name began looming over strategic calculations like a shadow, Washington understood something unsettling. The United States wasn't confronting a single nation. It was confronting an idea spreading from the Sahel to Johannesburg, from Cairo to Lagos, an idea whose weapon wasn't firepower but the determination of peoples once dismissed as powerless. In the empty late-night hallways of Washington, advisors left with thick folders under their arms. No one spoke aloud, but everyone felt the same truth. The real battle had begun. And this time, the opponent wasn't a government. It was a continent rediscovering its soul. When Washington finalized its first wave of sanctions, many in the West believed South Africa would buckle. They assumed Pretoria would soften its tone, rush to reopen negotiations, or at least try to calm tensions. But they forgot one thing: this is a nation that stood upright through the darkest brutality of apartheid. A people who survived the shadows of the 20th century do not tremble before the threats of the 21st. The next morning, inside the wide conference hall of the Union buildings, President Cyril Ramaphosa's voice rose, not with anger, but with the steadiness of someone who knows what is at risk is not policy, but dignity. He looked directly at his ministers. "We did not win our democracy by surrendering. And we will not defend it through fear." Those words became the anchor of the national spirit. No one in that room forgot that the self-determination they were defending was a gift paid for, at a terrible price, by generations before them. Hours later, Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor stepped onto the podium for a live press briefing broadcast across the continent. The room fell silent as she began. "South Africa is a sovereign nation. We do not take orders from any global power. We do not adjust policy in exchange for approval. And we do not negotiate justice." This was more than diplomacy, it was a declaration that the inner peace of a nation cannot be bought with aid. The sanctions Washington viewed as leverage became a test of South African resolve. When news spread that AGOA membership might be revoked, there was no panic. Instead, labor unions, local businesses, and civil society organizations spoke in unison. "If justice comes at a cost, we will pay it, but we will not back down." In Cape Town, farmers newly granted land titles told reporters they had waited nearly a century to reclaim what should have been theirs. No sanction, they said, could make him surrender that. Unity spread faster than anyone predicted. Universities hosted emergency forums on land history. Youth groups launched a campaign called We Stand With Our Land. Leading artists posted messages supporting the government without fear of losing international markets. The most striking thing wasn't the support, it was the calm. As if the nation had been waiting for this moment. The moment it could finally stand upright without being pulled back into the old circles of control. Even communities once skeptical of land reform began to see the bigger picture. This was no longer a dispute between South Africa and the United States. It was a conversation between a people and their own memory. When a young parliamentarian stood before the National Assembly and declared that a country cannot live forever in fear without losing its soul, the entire chamber rose in applause. Not because they agreed on every tactic, but because, for the first time in years, South Africa was moving not from reaction, but from leadership. As the sun set over Pretoria on that tense day, the streets remained calm, markets stayed open, children played soccer on red dirt fields as they always did. International reporters struggled to understand how a nation on the brink of sanctions could be so unshaken. But the answer came from the people themselves. "We have survived worse. No threat can frighten us when what we are doing is right." In that moment, the world finally understood. South Africa was not a victim of this storm. It was the pillar standing inside it. They weren't trying to soothe a superpower's anger, they were protecting their soul. And when a nation knows exactly where its soul resides, no pressure on earth can break it. No one in Washington imagined that a late-night post could push South Africa into the center of a rising economic alliance. But that is exactly what happened. When the US announced aid suspensions and threatened to cut South Africa from AGOA, BRICS members didn't see a weakened nation. They saw an opening, a power vacuum. And in international politics, vacuums are where new orders are born. In Shanghai, headquarters of the BRICS New Development Bank, an emergency meeting was convened less than 12 hours after the US announcement. There was no panic, no disagreement, only a single sentence from the NDB president slicing through the room like a blade. "One of our members is under attack. And we do not leave anyone standing alone." By midnight, a special $1.5 billion credit line had been approved to support South Africa's land reform. It wasn't just money, it was a declaration that Western punishment no longer decides the fate of a BRICS nation. In Moscow, the Russian Foreign Ministry released a statement far stronger than expected. Russia was ready to expand energy cooperation and integrate South Africa into the BRICS Resilience Grid, a project designed to reduce member nations' dependence on Western financial systems. What unsettled the West wasn't the contract value, it was the political signal. What once looked like a loose partnership was crystallizing into a strategic support network. Beijing moved almost instantly. A high-level delegation arrived unannounced in Pretoria. offering to fully fund the upgrade of the Durban-Mahikeng transport corridor, a critical artery connecting the port to the interior. It was infrastructure South Africa had long relied on Western loans to maintain. Now, as the old financial bridge burned, a new one rose from the east, without the familiar strings attached. Even India, typically cautious in foreign affairs, stepped forward. They proposed expanding bilateral trade settlements using the rupee and rand, easing pressure on South Africa's currency markets. A small gesture with a profound implication. An avenue for trade that bypassed the US dollar, a line Washington has always treated as untouchable. But the most powerful move wasn't financial, it was narrative. At the Sochi Economic Forum, a senior scholar stated, "South Africa is not isolated. South Africa is finally free to choose its partners." The words came wrapped in academic formality, but the meaning was razor-sharp. When America closed one door, BRICS opened three, and for the first time, an African nation did not fear the empty space between. The isolation Washington expected never materialized. Instead, it became the catalyst that allowed BRICS to demonstrate a unity the world had never seen so clearly. A bloc once dismissed as symbolic was now operating like a geopolitical institution. The sanctions on South Africa accidentally became the perfect stress test, and BRICS passed. Western analysts then asked, why was the response so strong? The answer wasn't economics. It was something deeper. South Africa wasn't just defending a land reform bill. It was defending the right to determine its future without bowing to external pressure. And BRICS saw in that struggle a reflection of itself, a sign that global power was shifting from old centers to new engines. As South Africa stood in the heart of the storm, BRICS turned that storm into wind in their sails, turning isolation into a weapon, turning sanctions into a call for unity. And from the soil of Pretoria, a message traveled across the world. When one nation dares to rise, others will step forward. Not for profit, but for meaning. Because in a world where the colors of power are changing, no one wants to stand with the past. While Washington's statements were still heating up global headlines, another movement was spreading quietly across the African continent. In the past, when a single African nation came under Western pressure, the rest often stayed silent to avoid being pulled into the storm. But this time was different. South Africa was not standing alone, and what was rising wasn't just support, but a new sense of shared destiny. In Nairobi, Kenya's Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua stepped up to the podium, his gaze steady on the cameras. He declared that no African nation should be punished for trying to correct historical injustice. The statement echoed across regional media, not as a defense of South Africa, but as a declaration for an entire continent, a declaration that the era of silence was over. In Abuja, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu addressed Parliament in a speech broadcast nationwide. He affirmed that Nigeria respected South Africa's sovereign right to shape its land policy and rejected the idea that any African nation could be intimidated by great powers. The applause that followed wasn't about local politics, it was about witnessing a historic shift. Africa was beginning to speak with one voice. At Addis Ababa, headquarters of the African Union, a closed meeting quickly expanded into a full assembly. Representatives from Senegal, Ethiopia, Botswana, Tanzania, Ghana, Rwanda, and Angola all voiced their support. When chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat stepped before the press and stated that no country has the right to punish a people seeking to heal wounds left by colonialism, it was seen as a milestone. For the first time in years, the wasn't reacting, it was leading. But the strongest impact wasn't felt in conference rooms. It spread through streets, universities, markets, and everyday conversations. In Dhaka, students hung banners reading "We Stand with South Africa." In Lusaka, youth groups organized spontaneous forums on land rights and collective memory. In Harare, a schoolteacher told her students that what was happening in South Africa was a lesson in dignity, not just politics. In Bamako and Niamey, Heartlands of the Traoré doctrine, people saw South Africa's actions as a natural extension of the sovereignty wave. They didn't speak of land, they spoke of freedom. Not of policy, but of Africa's future. Murals appeared in poor neighborhoods showing Ramaphosa beside Traoré, two different cuts of the same history converging into one. A continent once divided by borders, languages, and geopolitical algorithms now recognized a deeper common ground, memories stolen. And the longing to reclaim them. Exhaustion from decades of dependency. The desire to walk through the world at last on its own feet. What unsettles the West is not South Africa's land reform, it is Africa watching, learning, and awakening. An event that seemed isolated has become the catalyst for a new continental identity. An identity that no longer sees Africa as a recipient of aid, but as a generator of ideas. Not as a backyard of great powers, but as the center of the global debate on justice and sovereignty. As the sun set behind Table Mountain during those turbulent days, people across Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean, felt something shifting. Not the wind, not the weather, but consciousness. The awareness that a continent had awakened. And once awakened, no force on earth can make it sleep again. As Africa raised its collective voice in support of South Africa, another wave, just as powerful, began to rise far beyond the continent. It came from Black communities across the world, people carrying a memory that history has never fully healed. They were not South African citizens. They did not live on South African soil. Yet when they watched poor families in Limpopo or the Eastern Cape hold their new land certificates, they felt something unexpected, something profound. It felt as if a wound inside them was being stitched shut, one thread at a time. In Atlanta, inside a small barbershop, a group of African American men watched the news, an elderly South African woman breaking into tears as she reclaimed her ancestral land. The barber set his scissors down and murmured, "This isn't just land, this is giving a people back their soul." Silence filled the shop. They knew what stirred in them wasn't geography, it was history. A history in which their own ancestors were torn from the soil of Africa and dragged across oceans in chains. In New York, students at Howard University, one of the intellectual centers of Black America, held an emergency symposium. They discussed land rights, stolen memory, and something they called sovereignty restoration. An elderly professor pointed at a screen showing Ramaphosa and Traoré side by side and asked, "Why is it that when Black people reclaim what is theirs, the world calls it a threat?" No one answered, but everyone understood. The world has never been comfortable watching Black power return to Black hands. In London, Caribbean communities with roots in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados marched outside Parliament. The South African flag waved among signs demanding justice. An older woman told reporters that when she saw land being returned, she thought of the sugar fields where her great-grandfather was beaten to exhaustion. "Nothing can bring back the past," she said, "but justice has an echo. And today, that echo is coming from Africa." In Rio de Janeiro, graffiti artists painted Traoré alongside Latin American liberation icons. Beneath the mural were the words, "Where power was stolen, return begins." The vibrant colors weren't just art, they were a declaration from a generation that had waited too long for this moment. The moment when Africa was no longer the exploited continent, but the continent showing the way. As the diaspora watched from afar, they saw what many political analysts missed. South Africa's struggle wasn't merely economic. It was a battle over memory. Who gets to keep memory? Who gets to turn pain into sovereignty? Who gets to stand up and say that what was stolen will be returned? The response spread across social media with wildfire speed. Famous rappers mentioned Traoré in new tracks. African descendant influencers posted breakdowns of South Africa's land law as a spiritual victory for Black people everywhere. Hashtags like #BlackLandReturn and #FromAfrica to the world lit up feeds across continents. It was a movement without a government, yet more powerful than any government's declaration. On a podcast in Los Angeles, an activist put it simply, "We've fought for decades to reclaim dignity in the US, the UK, Brazil, but today, our motherland is reclaiming hers. And when the root stands tall, the branches cannot bow." The diaspora's rising tide was a reminder that history does not live only within borders. It lives in the memory of displaced communities, in stories passed through generations. When South Africa reclaimed land, it didn't just rewrite its own future. It opened a door for the black world to see something they had only dared to hope for. That return is no longer a dream. It is happening, through law, through justice, and through an unbreakable will. Before his name echoed through Pentagon briefings, before Western media labeled him the newest threat to the global order, Ibrahim Traoré was simply a young soldier standing in the Sahel desert, eyes fixed on the horizon. But some people are chosen by history before they fully understand what they've been handed. Traoré is one of them, not because he seized power, but because he redefined it in a way the world never expected. When Burkina Faso fell into a spiral of insecurity, poverty, and foreign influence, no one imagined a 30-year-old officer could change anything. Yet within months, Traoré did what many African leaders had long dreamed of but never dared. He ended dependence on foreign military bases. He tore up mining contracts deemed exploitative. He declared that resources belong to the people living on the land, not to suits signing papers in Paris or New York. This wasn't mere policy, it was the restoration of a nation's sense of self after generations taught to bow their heads. What made Traoré a symbol wasn't his youth or his boldness. It was that he didn't ask permission to do what he knew was right. In a world where small nations weigh every sentence for fear of offending great powers, Traoré chose the blunt honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose except silence. And that honesty sparked something. When he nationalized mineral mines, families in Kaya saw electricity in their schools for the first time, powered by resources from their own soil. When he demanded transparency from foreign companies, villages in the Sahel gained enough revenue to build clinics without waiting for aid. When he stood before Parliament and declared that Burkina Faso would never bow again, his words traveled farther than any border. They whispered through Nairobi's slums, spread across murals in Accra, and became a guiding philosophy for Africa's rising generation. This is why, when South Africa faced US sanctions, Traoré's name emerged instantly, not because he was involved, but because he had articulated a principle strong enough to transcend geography. Sovereignty is not something you request, it is something you declare. A nation that does not control its own resources cannot speak of its future. Justice does not flow from aid agreements, but from the courage to stand up and decide for oneself. Western policy experts call it the Traoré effect, but across Africa, people call it something else, the return of pride. Never before had a young leader forced the world to revise its view of the African continent so quickly. Traoré did not polish his image. He did not chase elegant speeches. He simply did what he believed his ancestors would have done: protect the land. Protect the gold. Protect the soul of the nation. When South Africans saw Burkina Faso endure global pressure without breaking, they understood they were not walking alone. And when Traoré posted the South African flag with the words, "Land is not a favor, it is a return," the entire continent sensed that this was no longer the story of two nations. It was the convergence of two historical currents long separated by colonial force and now reunited by the will to be free. In that moment, Traoré ceased to be merely the leader of Burkina Faso. He became the primal symbol of sovereignty, a reminder that any people can stand tall if they are brave enough to speak first. And today, as South Africa enters the greatest confrontation of the new era, Traoré's presence appears not as a commander, but as a mirror reflecting a question every nation must face. If we do not defend our own rights, who will do it for us? And it is that question that is reshaping the century. In the days following the clash between Washington and Pretoria, Western analysts struggled to understand why the global reaction was so unusual. They thought this was just a bilateral dispute, a simple policy disagreement, but in truth, the event acted like a blade lightly tapping the thin sheet of ice that hid far deeper fractures in the international order. And when that ice cracked, it became clear the world no longer operated under old logic. A new era was forming, not in New York or Brussels, but from the very continent once treated as the outer edge of power, Africa. In Paris, a seasoned diplomat admitted that Western influence was slipping faster than anyone had predicted. As African nations rallied behind South Africa instead of staying silent, it wasn't just solidarity, it was an affirmation that power no longer rests in the hands of a few self-appointed centers. A multipolar world doesn't emerge in a single moment. It is built from thousands of small decisions by nations choosing to free themselves from dependence. What's striking is that this rise isn't happening through military confrontation or arms races. It's unfolding in the area once dismissed as the weakest, the right to decide for oneself. When South Africa says land belongs to those who lost it. When Burkina Faso says gold belongs to those who live on it. When Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia insist that no nation has the right to punish a people repairing historical wounds, these are the first stones in the foundation of a multipolar order. But the shift isn't limited to Africa. In South America, countries see their own reflection in South Africa's stance. Across the Middle East and Southeast Asia, the unfolding events have become the clearest evidence yet that Western soft power is fading. And around the world, nations realize they can choose partners not out of fear, but out of interest and dignity. In Washington, classified reports reveal America's deepest concern, not South Africa's economy, but the possibility that this episode becomes a catalyst for strategic realignment. If a country can withstand sanctions and still find support from other power centers, the Western sanctions model loses its force. And when a tool loses its effectiveness, the power behind it loses meaning. Across Africa, people began discussing BRICS not merely as an economic bloc, but as an alternative ecosystem of power. In Warsaw and Berlin, security analysts questioned whether the West still held the authority to define democracy and sovereignty. In Beijing and Moscow, silent smiles appeared in meeting rooms, no words needed. They understood the world was entering a space where unipolarity had reached its end. But most important is the feeling among ordinary people. A young South African said on television that for the first time in his life, he felt his country wasn't following anyone, it was walking its own path. A mother in Burkina Faso said her child's school was finally built with money from their own minerals, not foreign aid. A student in Ghana said this moment shows Africa is no longer a shadow of history, but the author of the future. The multipolar world is not rising through gunfire. It's rising through calm yet cutting declarations, through decisions that refuse to bend, through nations once dismissed as small now daring to say no to old power and yes to themselves. And from the moment South Africa stood tall in the storm, the world understood, the old order had cracked, not to collapse into chaos, but to make room for something emerging from deep within the world's peoples, a world where power is more widely shared, where freedom isn't defined by the strong but by those brave enough to choose it. And in this global shift, Africa is no longer the distant observer. Africa has become the beating drum leading the rhythm of a new age. When we look back on the journey from that moment at 1047 to the shockwaves that circled the world, one truth can no longer be hidden. Africa has stepped out of the role the world forced upon it for centuries. No longer a continent waiting for judgment. No longer the periphery of geopolitical chessboards. No longer the place where others decide what it must become. Africa is standing tall, speaking in its own voice. And for the first time since colonial borders were drawn, the world has no choice but to listen. South Africa is not just fighting for land. Burkina Faso is not just fighting for minerals. Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia are not just fighting for respect. Together, They are writing the same chapter of history, one where the strength of a continent is measured not by poverty statistics, but by an unbreakable will. A chapter where every act of self-determination is not rebellion, but the return of dignity. We are witnessing a rise that does not look like thunder, but like sunrise, slow, steady, and impossible to obscure. This spirit moves from the farmers receiving their first legal plots, to the students chanting in support of South Africa, to the black communities in Atlanta, London, Rio. An invisible thread now binds them all, across languages, across oceans, across the walls of history that once separated people from their origins. And that is why this story does not end here. It is only beginning. If you've stayed with this journey until now, it means your heart is beating in rhythm with what is unfolding. It means you understand that the transformation of a nation is not just news, it is a reminder that the world becomes better when people rise to protect what is right. So raise your voice. Leave a comment and tell us what you see in this rising wave. Share this video so others can feel the moment we are living through. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and become part of the movement retelling the story of a continent awakening. Africa is rising. And you, by staying until the final word, have become a witness to that rise. There is so much more to tell. The journey has only just begun.